Hello and welcome back. As someone who also teaches Greek and Roman mythology for a living, I can't help but view history through the lens of legend and myth. That is, I think the stories that people tell about themselves have a lot to tell us about them and how they view their world. So this lecture is not going to be about how the Roman Empire got to be as big as it is on this map here. Instead, it's going to be about what the Romans say about how they got to be where they were. Let's start at the beginning. There was a Bronze Age settlement right near the Tiber, near what would become Rome, called Alba Longa, right here in the Italian peninsula. It shouldn't surprise us that almost as soon as Rome is founded, Alba Longa is destroyed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The king of Alba Longa was a guy named Numitor, and Numitor had a beautiful daughter named Rhea Silvia. The Roman god of war Mars sexually assaulted Rhea Silvia, impregnating her with twins. Well, it was right around this time that King Numitor was overthrown in a palace coup. And in order to make sure that there were no survivors, or people who could claim that they had the right to the throne, the guy who overtook Numitor made sure that Rhea Silvia's children were destroyed. However, instead of being killed, they were put into a basket and set to float in the Tiber River. And when they washed ashore in the basket, they were discovered by a wolf. And in Roman legend, and this is maybe the most iconic Roman image there is, a she-wolf is nursing Romulus and Remus, these two children. And you'll see this image all over Rome should you travel there. The interesting thing about this for us, those who study legend and those who study language, is the following thing. Lupa is the Latin word for she-wolf, but it's also Latin slang for whore or prostitute. So it's possible that they were the product of a sexual assault by a god, and that they were found by a she-wolf by the side of the river. But it's also possible that these were just the product of an unwanted pregnancy by someone who was not a god, and Romulus and Remus were in fact taken in by a prostitute. So there could be a kernel of truth in this legend. Either way, it's not the prettiest story. And in fact, he would wear a wolf pelt as a tribute to his adoptive mother, the she-wolf. All wouldn't end happy for the twins, though. When they came to be adults, they decided that they would found each their own city. And in a land dispute, Romulus killed his brother on the very foundations of his own city. Romulus' city, Rome, wasn't populated by the people you would expect it to be populated by. It was mainly filled with refugees from other places, and most of these refugees happened to be men. What were they going to do? How were they going to make more Romans? There were neighbors to the north called the Sabines. Romulus and the new Roman people would go north and visit them, and in a carefully coordinated attack, they would kidnap the Sabine women, in an event now known as the rape of the Sabine women. And here we see the Romans are abducting Sabine women in this picture by Jacques-Louis David. For a time, Rome would be ruled by kings from the north, from a place called Etruria. These Etruscan kings, as they came to be called, ruled for quite some time. Finally, in 509, the Romans kicked out the Etruscan kings who'd been ruling the city, and they formed a new kind of government. They had a republic with a senate, and Marcus Junius Brutus was its first consul. There are a couple of things to talk about here. One, the fact that 509 BCE is a time when other things were going on in the Mediterranean. You can think of another city that's undergoing a drastic change around this period, and that's Athens. This is around the time that Cleisthenes is struggling to begin making his reforms in Athens. Let's also talk about the person of Marcus Junius Brutus. As the Romans move from a monarchy to an aristocracy and what will become an oligarchy, they still need military leaders, like kings. But the Romans detest kings, so they have a figure more like a prime minister. This is called a consul. Their very first consul was a man named Marcus Junius Brutus. And Marcus Junius Brutus, does that name sound familiar? It should sound familiar. A distant descendant of his will later murder Caesar. Marcus Junius Brutus has an interesting name. Brutus, in Latin, means devoid of intellect, or stupid to the point of being mentally disabled. How did a guy like this come into power? People had a habit of telling Marcus Junius Brutus things they probably shouldn't have told him, because they thought he wasn't that bright and he wouldn't do anything with the information. When it came time to elect a consul at the foundation of the Republic, Marcus Junius Brutus had all the goods on the other senators. So they declared him to be their consul. So it was only shortly after this the Etruscan kings would try to get help in being reinstated in Rome. A king by the name of Lars Porsena would help them with the invasion. However, young Roman men determined to kill Lars Porsena, ending the invasion, swam across the river and snuck into his camp. One such man was a man by the name of Mucius Scaevola. Mucius Scaevola, when captured by the guards of Lars Porsena, in order to show the king what he was made of and what Romans were made of, put his hand in a fire nearby to show that he didn't care about his own body. Lars was so taken with this act of valor that he sent Mucius back, and the Romans came to call Mucius Scaevola after this, because he burned off his right hand. The Romans called him Scaevola, meaning lefty. So what can we say about all these stories? The Romans see themselves as children of wolves. Wolves weren't thought of by anyone in the Mediterranean as the nicest of animals. In fact, seen as an animal of low moral character. What does it say that their founders were a product of rape with the god of war? What does it say that their founders were themselves people who kidnapped women? What does it say that the Romans cherished in their stories people who would willingly mutilate their own bodies just to prove a point? Well, I guess we could say that on the positive side of things, the Romans viewed themselves as very tough and doing whatever it took to get by. They viewed themselves as being descended from a warrior god, and they treasured the ability to get things done, even if they weren't as good at speaking as the Greeks. Think about these legends as you learn of the early history of the Romans through the end of the Republic. They have a lot to tell us about how the Romans thought of themselves, and how others would come to think of them too. Stay tuned for my next lecture on the Punic Wars.